Welcome back, everybody. Today we begin our third unit of 3 units. This is our unit where we talk about the hot button issues, or the term that I prefer, the canon of issues, that certainly non-Catholics look at the Catholic Church and sort of dismiss it for these reasons, these issues that we're going to be talking about. Even a lot of Catholics themselves either abandon the church, or maybe they'll cherry pick, become those cafeteria Catholics where they say, well, I like this teaching, so I'll take it, but I'm going to reject this other teaching over here because I don't like it. And that likely are some of the issues that we're going to talk about today and throughout this unit. I'd mentioned something at the end of last week's video, which, thinking back on this week as I was preparing for this lecture, I don't think it was entirely accurate. What I said was that the different topics that we're going to be talking about in this unit are not connected to each other. There's kind of a hodgepodge. And in a sense, that is true. So think, for example, in our last unit when we talked about the issues of theology, Christology, anthropology, that they were tied together with that thread of soteriology. And I think something similar actually is happening here in this unit, although it wasn't on my mind when I was lecturing on this last week. And that is that, yes, these issues on the surface may not seem to connect in any ways, but underneath there is a sort of deeper connection. And what that connection is a unit we talked about last time, anthropology, our understanding of the human person. Now, we talked in a limited way about that. We talked about the Pelagian controversy. We talked about grace and free will and that sorts of thing. But there's so much more to the human person than just that. And when we look at not just these issues in this unit, but really if you think about what's going on in our culture today, there's a lot of people of a lot of different religions and political stripes and philosophies, and a lot of people will agree, even though I disagree on those specific things, that we're sort of going through a civilizational crisis, right? That some people are talking about, sort of comparing the U.S. and the collapse of the U.S. empire or the Western civilization to the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapse of classical civilization at the end of late antiquity and the beginning of the early medieval period. This isn't the place to adjudicate that question. But I think there are serious conversations happening and that need to be happening about what's going on in our culture. And in order to begin to understand and answer those questions, I think if we look closely at what are the things that we're fighting about, that we can begin to understand what is the root of this crisis in the Western civilization. And I don't need to tell them to you, and we're going to be talking about some in this unit, right? Transgender issues, sexuality issues, death penalty, abortion, all of these things, right? The list goes on. What is the thing that ties those things together? And that is the idea that they're all dealing with the human person, right? So we talked, for example, a couple weeks ago on the unit of the Trinity. And I think I'd mentioned that in the 4th century, people died over this. They killed each other, whether they supported Nicaea or they supported Arius, right? Today, certainly, people of faith might fight over the question of the Trinity. For example, Christians and Mormons might disagree or even argue over that question. But I think it's safe to say, for the most part, at least within Christianity, people aren't fighting that much about it. And when you look at secularists or atheists, and when they look at Christianity and the things that they critique about Christianity, it's not about whether God is one or Trinitarian. They might argue whether or not God exists or not, sure, but they're not fighting over how do we understand the Trinity. So what are we fighting over in our culture today? And the answer is anthropological issues. So that's what we're fighting over. So that's I think, sort of symptomatic of the underlying question of what's going on in Western civilization. And so something that keeps coming to mind when I think about this question is a phrase from Gaudium et Spes. Those of you who've taken my church history course, we read this whole document together. This is arguably the most important document from Vatican II, the joy and the hope. And that's what Gaudium et Spes means. It's in Latin. And there's a great line in section 36 that says, when the creator is forgotten, the creature increasingly grows unintelligible. When the creator is forgotten, the creature increasingly grows unintelligible. So in this unit for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be, this unit in general, but this first book that we're going to be talking about for the next 2 weeks, getting into the question of transgender, and is going to be, the author is going to be talking about feminism. Today, we can't even decide who's a man and who's a woman. And I would argue, echoing Gaudium et Spes, that the reason why we're fighting over these issues, who is a man, who is a woman, what's the proper use of sex, should gay people have gay marriage civilly or even in Christian spheres, that all of these are anthropological questions. And why are we fighting over anthropology as opposed to Trinity or Christology or any of the fights that people had in the 16th century between Catholics and Protestants? Why are we fighting over anthropological issues in our society today? It's because we don't understand who the human person is. We don't understand who the human person is. And why is that? I think Gaudium et Spes is right. When the creator is forgotten, the creature increasingly grows unintelligible. So that's the thread, I would argue, that connects not just the different texts that we're reading in this unit together, but really as we see all of these different fights happening in different circles in our public discourse today in 21st century Western society, that I would argue is the root of why we're fighting over those things. So keep that in mind in the coming weeks as we go through the rest of the semester. Why are we talking about these issues? And we're starting today with the transgender question. It has to do with anthropology, because we don't even know what it means to be a human being anymore. We don't even know who's a man and who's a woman. So we're beginning with, for this week and next week, we're going to read this whole book called The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory by Abigail Favale. I think this is a fantastic book, and this came out a few years ago, and it sort of broke onto the scene within certain Catholic circles. This was kind of a hot book for a year or so. She is now a professor at the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame. On the back of the book, I think it says that at the time she was at George Fox University in Oregon. And she had been a student there, and then after she got her doctorate, she was there for many years. If you're interested in Favale, she's all over the internet, and because that's partly what the McGrath Institute is about. It's sort of theology in the public sphere, right? She's a public intellectual. She's been on lots of podcasts and YouTube channels, including mine. I've interviewed her twice, and she's been on Matt Fradd's show, if you're interested, in a couple of times, I think, as well. I interviewed her before and after she wrote this book. She also references in this book that she has a conversion narrative, and that's how I first got to know her. That you know, again, kind of made her well known in certain circles. And then she came out with this book. And my first interview with her had to do with sort of John Paul II's thought on women, and then the second one has to do with this book. I think it's a wonderful vision of a Christian theory, a Christian anthropology of understanding or response to this feminism and transgender questions. She kind of hints at, or not hints at, but talks about this in the book because she weaves throughout this book some of her personal narrative, although she gets fully into her conversion story in her other book, Into the Deep is what it's called. And, you know, she was a feminist. Now, a lot of people claim to be feminists, but usually what they mean by that simply is, you know, I think women should be paid equal in the workplace, right? Well, I think women should be paid equal in the workplace too, but that doesn't make me a feminist. She was a feminist in the sense that she has a PhD in feminist theory and feminist thought. She's, as you will see in this book, she's read them all, right? All the big ones, and she talks about some of the big names, Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, and others. So these are names that we're going to encounter as you read this text. So she has a PhD in this theory. and then converts to Catholicism. She's not a theologian. She's I think she's generally in English departments, that type of thing. She's in critical, not critical race theory, but feminist theory. So that's generally in gender studies departments or women's studies departments or English departments. So that's kind of her area. So what I want to do in this lecture today is go through a few sections of her book and then sort of give a greater context for some of the things that she's talking about, which you may or may not understand, but I think underpin what's going on in feminist thought, and then more recently the sort of gender theory that's going on. So let's just begin. This is on page 22, and what she's going to do here kind of in passing is talk about what's called postmodernism. And what I want to do in this lecture, among other things, is expand on what she's saying about postmodernism, because postmodernism is kind of the general philosophical worldview that rests underneath these more specific, concrete philosophies of feminism or gender theory. So if you want to turn with me to the bottom of page 22, this is the last paragraph there. So she says, postmodern, to put it simply, is a worldview that sees reality in terms of narratives that are created by human beings rather than an order of objective truths that can be discovered by human beings. Postmodernism reflects a deep skepticism towards meta-narratives, collective explanatory narratives that give an overarching account of reality. So, for example, meta-narratives might be, Darwinism or Marxism or Freudianism, right? These sort of grand narratives, meta-narratives, meta meaning across, as opposed to particular individual stories of this person or that person, but narratives that make sense of the totality of human existence and existence in general. Christianity or any established religion certainly counts as a meta-narrative, as does an atheistic scientism. Postmodernism is equally skeptical of an Enlightenment understanding of reality as it is of a Christian one. Postmodernists don't necessarily reject the existence of God, but they do reject the knowability of God and objective truth. God is not a being who discloses himself to us through the created order and divine revelation. Rather, God is merely a projection of human desires, a story we tell ourselves. Okay? So what I want to do for the next few minutes is go a little bit more deeply into what postmodernism is and begin where she mentions at the middle of that paragraph, when she says postmodernism is equally skeptical of an Enlightenment understanding of reality as it is of a Christian one. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about the Enlightenment, or otherwise known as the Age of Reason, which some of you who've taken my church history course, we've covered that, so that part might be a bit repetitive for you, but that's okay. Repetition's the best way to learn anything. But then I want to get into postmodernity. And we have to talk about both of those because postmodernism is skeptical of Enlightenment philosophy just as much as it is of Christianity, as Favali says. So we got to understand this Enlightenment. In other words, sometimes people talk about postmodernity as a sort of child of modernity that then kills its parent, right? It's sort of that Oedipal way. So that's what I want to do here for the next few minutes. So to understand what's going on today, frankly, you have to back up 500 years. You have to go back to the early modern period with the fights between Catholics and Protestants. And both sides, of course, fought among a variety of different specific issues. But both sides claimed to be right. And they grounded in their claims of being right in general on sort of the idea that, well, we Protestants or we Catholics, we have the Holy Spirit and you don't, so we know that we're right. So the technical term there is epistemology, the way that we know something. And that's what really I would argue is the big question in the West over the last 500 years. Just think about this question about who is a man and who is a woman. As soon as you start asking that question, you then have to ask the question, well, how do you know that? The epistemological question. So epistemology is always the sort of boogeyman that's in the background or lying underneath any particular issue these days, it seems like. So the Protestants and the Catholics fought over different things, and they both said that their epistemology was right and it was grounded in faith. Now, by the time you get to sort of late 16th and early 17th century, because of these fights between Catholics and Protestants, and not just intellectual fights, but violence. There were a lot of wars that were happening between Catholics and Protestants during this time. There was a sort of rejection of that, a pushback of that, and said, this is really ugly. All it does is it leads to war. So what we need to do is have a different, better epistemology, a better way of knowing something, so that when we think through an issue, we can rely on this epistemology, and this epistemology is sort of universal to all people. And it can be sort of more objectively determined, because of course you can't really objectively determine who has the Holy Spirit and who doesn't have the Holy Spirit. There's no test for that, right? So the epistemology that then becomes in vogue is the epistemology of reason. This is where we get the idea of the age of reason, or the Enlightenment, or modernity. These are all sort of synonyms for each other, right? So it's not, of course, to say that the Enlightenment invented reason. You can go back thousands of years to the Greeks, for example. But the idea is that epistemology is alone reason in this Enlightenment, that you can't rely on intuition or feeling or the church or the Bible or your faith or anything like that. And the idea is that all people have reason, okay? And that we can and need to exercise that reason. And the theory, anyways, is that if that's the epistemology that we use, then we can all come to know truth, right? Because my reason isn't different from your reason. I don't necessarily have more reason. Now, I might go through more schooling and use my reason more than, say, a manual laborer. But, we all have reason. So reason becomes the epistemology of the modern age. Again, this, roughly speaking, scholars love to fight over this. When does this happen? Say maybe around the beginning of the 17th century to, again, maybe the beginning of the 20th century. A lot of people would point to Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, as the beginning of postmodern thought. Other people would push it back to post-World War II. We don't really need to get into the fights on that, but the point is that modern age lasted for about 300 years or so, okay? Now, with this shift to the epistemology of reason, you have a variety of what I like to call dominoes that then fall. Or another way of putting it is civilization kind of reorders itself around this way of thinking, this epistemology of reason. So, for example, you can think about the rise of the modern nation states, specifically places like the United States and France after the French Revolution, because what happens there is, of course, you have representative governments, republics or democracies that come into flourishing at this time. Now, where did this come from? It's not like it just came out of nowhere. Prior to this period, you have what's sometimes called the divine right of kings, the idea that God has ordained a person or a family, a monarch, to rule in the temporal sphere, and that person has God's sort of backing. Well, if you shift to the idea of reason as the epistemology, then what ends up happening is, and you say that all people have reason, then the conclusion is, well, if everybody has reason, then everybody can rule themselves. You don't need a divinely appointed ruler, a monarch ruling over you. So the advent of things like the United States or the French Revolution didn't just sort of historically happen accidentally, but they come out of this shift in thinking about reason, okay? So you have the rise of representative governments. You have a rise of capitalism. Think to, if you ever took economics classes, of course, this is not an economics class. We don't have time to get into the details. But at least in theory, one of the sort of fundamental principles of capitalism is sort of rational market makers, that people will only do what is best for them in terms of, you know, what they buy or savings, right? That I need to save an X amount of dollars, and that's what's best for me in my particular situation. Also, what you have is the rise of modern science, the scientific method, modern medicine. Now, again, this is not to say that those things didn't exist before. Of course they did. But what you have is a shift, for example, let's take medicine as an example, that when you had a sort of Christian worldview, you'd look at the body and you think that the body is sacred. It's holy. So therefore, you couldn't do things like autopsies, or you could only sort of do limited types of experiments on the body. You couldn't cut into the body and do tests on it. Well, if you've thrown out God, and that's what happens in this Enlightenment period, is you have this sort of slow rejection of God and Christianity in particular, well, then you have a different understanding of the human person. Why can't you do autopsies? Why can't you experiment on the body? You don't see the body as sacred anymore. Another thing related to the rise of science, modern science. Again, there was science beforehand. Let's take astronomy as an example. Prior to this modern age, you would look up at the stars or you would study the world around you. And the fundamental assumption was that this is created by a creator. So therefore, in studying the stars or studying the planets or studying the earth, you can learn something about God, that the created world has God's imprint in it. And so we can get a glimpse or a taste of who the creator is. But if, as you start to get in this secularized Enlightenment period, throwing out the idea of God and Christianity, well, then the goal of science is not to get a better understanding of God, but frankly, it kind of has two goals now. One is simply know the world, the created world around us for its own sake, but probably more importantly is, and this is the sort of pairing of science, medicine, technology, and capitalism, the idea of we can come to master and harness the natural world, the natural resources that are available to us, and those things can make our lives more comfortable, right? So the goal is you know, air conditioning and airplanes and that sort of thing to make my life better, make my life more comfortable. So again, it's not that science is new or medicine is new, but it's a totally different way of thinking about it. As I said, you have a rejection of God or a rejection of Christianity in particular here in the West. An example of this is deism. We often think of the founding fathers of our country as Christians, but that's not accurate. They were deists. A deist was somebody, for example, who would look at the world and think about the world like a clock. And they thought of God, that there is a God, but that God's not a personal God. The God is a clockmaker. And that when God created the world, he wound it up and set it down. And it worked on its own, the way a clock will work once the clockmaker is finished with it. And then the clockmaker sort of walks away and lets the clock do its own thing. Christianity, of course, rejects that idea and says, no, God is personal to the point of becoming a human being and dying on the cross for the sins of humanity. A perfect example of this idea of deism is Thomas Jefferson had something that he didn't publish in his own lifetime, but later was discovered after his death in one of the drawers of his home. It's come to become known as the Jefferson Bible. And what he did was he went through the Gospels and he literally cut out sections of the Gospels that seemed to him to be impossible because they were sort of supernatural. So Jesus, for example, casting out demons or walking on water or that sort of thing. And so the only thing that you're left with in Thomas Jefferson's Bible, which you can buy online, by the way, you can get a copy of this, is things like, you know, his homilies or his preaching, his Sermon on the Mount, that type of thing. So he's, in Thomas Jefferson's view, a sort of great wise figure, a prophet, but certainly not divine, okay? So you have a shift in thinking about religion during this time period. You also have a shift in sort of philosophy and morality. So With a rejection of things like the church and the Bible and faith, that sort of thing, the question then becomes, well, how do we know about what's true? We talked about reason, but also what is good, what is moral. And so you have sort of moral systems that arise that don't depend on revelation, but depend on reason. So think, for example, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. It's in really sort of obtuse language, but it's really quite simple. The idea is that you should make into any a moral law based on what you yourself would want done to you. So in other words, if you don't want to be murdered, well, then that should be a universal law, right? If you don't want people to steal from you, well, then that's probably should be made a universal law, right? That I don't need God to tell me thou shalt not murder, that my reason can tell me to do so. So reason dictates what is moral. And philosophically, again, that there is an objective truth that is, in other words, a truth that stands outside my subjective opinion, and that truth can be known, not, again, through revelation, but through my reason. So, again, subjective versus objective. So subjective would be my favorite ice cream is chocolate, for example. That's just my opinion. Maybe vanilla is your favorite flavor. But objectivity, an objective truth, is a truth that stands outside of my mere opinion and is true for all people, no matter the culture or the gender or the time or the geography. So 2 + 2 = 4 is an objective truth, whether I like it or not, right? That stands outside of my opinion. So the idea of there are ultimate truths, they're objective, they stand outside myself, and that I can know them, but I know them through reason. Another thing in this Enlightenment period is the idea of progress. And this is something today that still sticks around. And a lot of, frankly, Christians have this sort of secular Enlightenment view. And that is this idea of progress, a slow progress towards a perfected humanity. In other words, if we have enough time, if we have enough money, if we have enough will, if you know, science progresses and medicine progresses, that someday we can usher in a perfect society where there's no poverty, there's no illness, there's no death, everybody's at peace. So when you look, for example, in the utopian movements over the past 150 years plus, these are all sort of grounded in that assumption about progress, right? Think of Marxism. Marxism is, among other things, a utopian vision that you can usher in a perfect society. And this is a rejection of the Christian view. A lot of what sort of rests underneath in Enlightenment thought is an implicit or explicit rejection of Christian worldview. So this idea of progress, of a perfected humanity, is a rejection of the Christian understanding that we've talked about in this class, the idea of original sin, of the brokenness of humanity, right? What does Jesus say in the Gospels? He says that you will always have the poor with you, right? In other words, Jesus says, because of the brokenness of humanity, because of original sin, there will never be a perfect society here on earth. So Christianity is an anti-utopian religion, whereas the Enlightenment is this idea of progress, that technology, for example, can usher in a sort of golden age of humanity. So this was, for about 300 years, the sort of dominant vision, philosophical vision in the West. And it made a lot of these promises, like promise towards a perfected humanity, as we were just talking about. So a lot of promises were made during this time, but by the time you get to the 20th and now the 21st century, people started to say, okay, where's the result of these promises, right? These promises that the Enlightenment has made. So one, for example, is look at the first half of the 20th century, and even right up till today, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in the history of humanity, right? Think about World War I, World War II, communism, genocide after genocide after genocide. So if the Enlightenment says that we're on a long, slow, progressive arc towards a perfected humanity, the 20th century is kind of empirical evidence against that. And so postmodernity starts to bubble up, again, sort of the end of the 19th century and sort of rise. And this is generally the age that we're in now. Postmodernity, that we're after modernity. We're after this Enlightenment or after this age of reason. Because in general, the postmodern mind rejects modernity in many ways because the failure to live up to what it promised, right? So you start to have a variety of, as I said earlier, the child is killing the parent, a sort of rejection of a lot of those modern assumptions. And so what I want to do is get into some of these postmodern assumptions that reject the modern assumptions. And again, the reason why I'm going through this is because this is what rests underneath a lot of what Favali is talking about with feminism and transgender theory. Okay, so what are some of these assumptions from the postmodern mind? And you can see this, I think, best in secondarily maybe the philosophers, but primarily in the artists, right? And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think artists, playwrights, musicians, authors, generally are on the cutting edge, that they're the kind of canary in the coal mine. So when you go back to early 20th century and you sort of study postmodern art, you can sort of see these postmodern assumptions at play. So one is the rejection of reason, right? Certainly reason as the only epistemology. And the postmodern mind would say we either need to have a multiplicity of epistemologies, or there's no reliable epistemology. Because when the modern age says, well, we can land on reason, we can use reason as opposed to revelation or faith as a way of knowing something, and we all have reason. Well, again, look at the 20th century, right? The fights that were happening in World War I and World War II, right? Where's the reason there? Killing off half the European population doesn't quite sound reasonable, right? So a deep suspicion of this idea or rejection of reason. So calling into question everything. This is sort of a postmodern move, calling into question everything, being deeply skeptical of all truth claims, and in fact, even rejecting the idea of truth claims at all. So a rejection and calling into question the idea of reason. That we can't be certain of anything. So one of the things that Catholicism says is there are certain things we can be certain about, right? That God reveals himself to us. And because God is revealing himself to us, that we can be certain of that. Or the modern age says we can be certain of what we know to be true through reason. The postmodern mind looks at all these claims and is suspicious and rejects all of them and says, no, in fact, we can't be certain of anything, right? The only thing that we can be certain about is uncertainty. And so what that sort of ushers in is, again, that sort of radical skepticism, a radical instability, that we aren't standing on solid ground, as the old hymn goes, but that we are, in fact, standing on shifting sands, or we're in a boat out in the ocean, and we have no idea where to go. So distrust is central, skepticism is central, uncertainty is central. In fact, I would say suspicion bordering on paranoia, right? Being suspicious of everything. A rejection of universal truths. So the modern mind says that there are truths out there and we can know them through reason. The postmodern mind says, well, not only can we not know those objective truths, but there are no objective truths. And this comes out of things like the rise of anthropology in the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. That there are certain truths that people claimed to be true here in the West, but then they go to in the 20th century as anthropologists to the Amazon or to India or a variety of other places and study other cultures and see that other cultures do things radically different and in many ways opposite of what we in the West do. And so, and those things that they do in those countries or those cultures are considered to be moral, whereas we would consider those things to be immoral. So, I don't know, for example, polygamy, right? That a sort of fundamental Western assumption for a very long time was polygamy was morally wrong. But you can go to other countries and see polygamy as well. So a rejection of universal truths, either philosophical truths or moral truths, the idea that there are no universal moral truths. The caveat to that would sometimes be added, you know, as long as you don't hurt somebody else, right? That I can construct my own moral truths, and as long as they don't hurt somebody else, then that's okay. That's kind of the maybe one and only limit to these moral conditions. So that brings in moral relativism. This is a sort of watchword of the day, that there are no moral truths. Everything is relative, meaning relative certain to a time period or a culture, but even more on a micro level relative to people, right? That my moral truths might be true for me and your moral truths might be true for you. And we might live in the same time period and the same culture, but it doesn't matter that we have come through our experience, for example, to come to different conclusions about what is moral. So these points together kind of bring together what I like to call the democracy of truth. Democracy of truth, that you vote on what's truth, not in a sort of formal way like going to the ballot box, but that people come together and what is true today because we, you know, maybe in a majority opinion have ordained something to be true, but later on, for whatever reason, the culture shifts and new truths are declared, and those are oftentimes codified in law, right? So there's always a legal aspect to this too, because our laws are oftentimes codifications of moral truths. And so laws can come and go, laws can change in this worldview because moral truths come and go, that we sort of vote informally, so to speak, based on what truths that we think are true today. A few more of these fundamental assumptions of the postmodern mind. One is that we sort of live in a decentered world, getting back to that claim I said about an instability. So decentered, literally speaking, first of all, meaning that we are not the center of the universe, whereas in prior centuries, there was this assumption that Earth was literally the center of the universe and all things revolve around us. But as the scientific astronomy, the scientific world comes to understand the universe better, we find out, well, in fact, we're kind of one planet among many in a sort of dusty outpost in the corner of the galaxy, right? That we are insignificant. We find through things like Einstein that time and space are relative, light is relative, right? Light bends. So we are not the center of things, and that sort of physical understanding of the physical world as being decentered, again, that even time is not concrete, that it is relative, the theory of relativity, that sort of spills into the sort of moral and philosophical spheres, that everything else is relative. There are no rules. This is another sort of assumption of the postmodern mind. And this is what I was sort of hinting at earlier about in the art sphere, right? That in the 20th century, when you look at art, the sort of goal or objective of art is sort of to break all rules, to be radically new, that's never been done before. Whereas prior to that, there are certain assumptions about what's good art or what's beautiful art. And the postmodern art world rejects that and says there's no good, there's no true, there's no beautiful, objectively speaking. What I find is beautiful, and what you find is beautiful might be different. There's that phrase, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's a very postmodern way of thinking, right? You go back to Thomas Aquinas, for example. He has very explicit rules or universals about what we can call beautiful, not just in the artistic world, but just in the world in general. So there are no rules. You can see this in the art world, but again, in a lot of different spheres in the postmodern mind, a sort of radical break, an attempt to radically break the rules around us. And so there is in the postmodern mind a sort of anarchist bent. That doesn't mean everybody's necessarily out there running around, trying to tear down governments. But you have, again, tearing down the sexual laws, the sexual rules of a society, right? That's why if you think of the sexual revolution in the 1960s, again, that wasn't historically accidental. It didn't just happen. It comes out of a particular mindset, this postmodern mindset, that says there are no rules. So if we apply that to the sexual realm, why are we following rules like, don't have sex out of wedlock, and only men and women should have sexual relations within marriage, all those sort of classical traditional rules. So let's break those rules because there are no rules, and that these rules are well, we'll talk more about this in a minute. They're not just arbitrary. They're moves of power. There is no meaning in this life, right? That from a Christian perspective, meaning is something that's handed to me. Think about my vocation, that I have to discern what my vocation is and live in harmony. Or we talk about the universal call to holiness, that my life is a flourishing life when I live a holy life. The postmodern mind says, well, there's no truths and there's no meaning. And so my job is to wake up every day and create meaning for myself. Right? This, I would argue, is the sort of root of many of the anxiety and depression that's happening these days, and is often, I would say, misdiagnosed as a sort of biological or chemical in the brain, a chemical imbalance. Certainly there are people who have that, and I don't want to dismiss that. But when you are told by this postmodern world that your job is to wake up every day and create meaning, well, then why are we surprised that people are anxious and depressed, feeling like they're in a boat on the ocean being knocked around by the waves, right? So the postmodern mind says that meaning is self-generated. There is no meaning. Everything, therefore, is open to individual interpretations. That's something that I might find meaningful. You might not find meaningful. So I might find, working with the poor to be profoundly meaningful, and you may not. And so there is no objective good in reaching out to those on the margins. This is just a sort of personal opinion, personal taste. Finally, this idea of rejection of that modernist idea of objectivity, that everything is subjective. Everything is subjective. There's no such thing as truths. So then if there's no such thing as truth, then, and this starts with what Favali starts to get at in this book, is, okay, truth claims are made, so what are those truth claims? And this has to do, she talks about people like Michel Foucault and others, that they say that because there's no truth, that any truth claim is simply an exertion of power. So if the Catholic Church says, you should not have certain sexual types of actions, the Catholic Church would say, well, we're making that claim because that's in harmony with reality, whereas the postmodern mind says, well, there is no objective reality, so these truth claims are just exertions of power, and that we need to be suspicious of these truth claims. There's a term, I can't remember if Favali uses it, the term is the hermeneutic of suspicion. Hermeneutics means this is how we interpret something, a text or something else, and so we have to be deeply suspicious of it, to look underneath it and see what's really going on. So you have what are called the masters of suspicion, like Nietzsche or Freud or Marx, What Marx says is that what's really going on in society is a conflict, class struggle between the people who have and the people who don't have, and that any sort of laws that are established or truth claims that are made because those who have are trying to oppress and keep down the people who don't have. And so what we need to do, according to people like Marx and these other masters of suspicion, is look underneath the truth claims and to see what's really going on. What are the power moves that are actually happening? And that's, if you hear the word power come up over and over and over again today, because that is what motivates us. That's what keeps the world moving, so to speak. That everybody, we're just sort of all trying as best we can to exert our power over other people, that we're not trying to submit to truth. So we see this all around us in our public discourse. And so this then becomes related to language. In the middle 20th century and into today, scholars become very interested in language, because prior to the 20th century, there was a general assumption that language sort of is an articulation or a pointer to something outside of itself, and that thing is truth. But if you don't believe there's truth, and if you think that everything that is said is simply a power game, then we have to look very closely at language. And that language becomes of great interest to people like Foucault and Butler, because what they're saying is the way we use our language is a sort of power move. That yes, shooting people, killing people, using violence, that's one type of very explicit power. But language is implicit, and it's more dangerous in the sense that it doesn't kill people like a gun kills people, but it's insidious in that way. And so for Foucault and other postmodern thinkers, we have to look closely at language to see how is power being exerted through the use of language. And so one of the things that Favali gets into, certainly this week, but even so more so in our lecture next week, when it comes to this transgender question, why are we fighting over pronouns? And why do people get hysterical when you don't use the pronoun that they want you to use? It's not simply because they're crazy or hysterical. It's that they have certain philosophical assumptions about what you're doing when you refuse to use the pronoun that they want. You are using a power move to oppress them because they want you to call them, he, but you refuse to do so because that person is a woman. And so this is why they're so hypersensitive to this use of pronouns, because it's not just something they randomly chose to get upset about, but it comes out of these philosophical assumptions about power and the use of language and how language is a tool to exert power over certain groups, and specifically oppressed groups. And so transgender people, I think most people would put them in the category of being sort of a minority, and they would consider themselves to be an oppressed minority. And so your refusal or my refusal to use the gendered pronoun that they want you to use is an act of violence to them, because it is a power game using words, not guns. All right, so that's a very long explanation, expanding on what Favali talks about when she talks about postmodernity. And again, I think that's important because all of what she's saying about the sort of history of feminist thoughts and this gender theory that's really developed in the past few decades, what's undergirding them are these postmodern assumptions. And so we need to take that step back and look at the development of Western thought to figure out how we got to where we are today. Again, we shouldn't just dismiss people when they say, get really upset about pronoun language and say, oh, they're just crazy people. No, they have philosophical assumptions, which you may not agree with, but we have to take them seriously. And as Favali does in this book, try to counter that and say, well, no, there are certain truths, right? There is an essential, there's something essential to being a man and a woman, for example. So let's have that background in our minds about postmodern thought as we hear what Favali has to say about feminist thought and gender thought. Next, if you would please turn with me to page 60. This is something else that is very important that she talks about a little bit, but I think we need to... sorry, actually, it's page 69. If you would turn, please, to page 69. So what a word she uses here and throughout the book that I think we need to have a clear understanding on, the word is telos or telos. So let's read this long paragraph on 69. While few feminists now would claim to be self-consciously existentialist, I would argue that Simone de Beauvoir's understanding of freedom and autonomy continue to animate the pro-abortion feminist position. The famous line in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the Supreme Court decision to uphold abortion as a right, has clear existentialist undertones. Quote, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence. That's very postmodern. Think back to what I was just saying. Of meaning of the universe and the mystery of human life, right? You get to define it. It's up to you. You don't receive it from your Christian tradition or some other tradition. Unquote. There is no sense in this statement that there is a givenness to the world to which we are accountable, that an unborn human being might exist whether we like it or not, and the fact that the existence might demand a particular ethical response from us. Gone is the ancient view that the meaning exists inherently in the world and can be recognized by human beings. Gone is the understanding of a shared human flourishing, or eudaimonia, right? That's a Greek word, human flourishing, that is achieved by living in accordance with our nature. Gone, in fact, is the idea of human nature altogether. The only telos is an open-ended freedom, an endless journey of self-creation with no particular destination. One's telos is to define one's telos. Again, I hope you see just how postmodern that is, but let's get into that a little bit more. What is she getting at? So the word telos is Greek, or telos, and it means sort of the end or goal or objective. So you've heard me say this already in this semester. I'm sure I'll quote it again from St. Augustine. Praying to God, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until it rests in you. What is Augustine telling us our telos is? You have made us for yourself. That our goal, our objective, our orientation has to be towards God. And when it's not oriented towards God, it becomes oriented elsewhere, like ourselves. That's when sin happens, right? Think back to our conversation on original sin. So the telos is the goal or end of something. And this is frankly not a uniquely Christian idea. It can be traced back to the pre-Christian Greek philosophers like Aristotle and others. But from a Christian perspective, we human beings have this end that I just mentioned from Augustine. But you can even think parts of our lives have their own telos. So sex is for procreation and union, for example, that yes, it's pleasurable, but that's not its telos. That when pleasure becomes the telos, as it has been in the past few decades, it becomes disordered, right? It's certainly fine that sex is pleasurable, but that's not its goal. But when we make it the goal, think of pornography, for example, or using contraception in the sexual act, that's when it becomes disordered. Or another example is food, that food is fuel for the body. We need calories to live. Yes, it tastes good, but it becomes disordered when we use food for a different reason, like pleasure, like enjoying the taste, because that can lead to a gluttonous attitude or mindset. Or think of the eating disorders, right? Anorexia, for example, that's the idea, that's a disorder. The idea that we are using food or not using food in a way that is not ordered towards its natural or proper end, which is, again, fuel for the body. So this Greek and Christian way of thinking about the human person, or particular parts of the human person, is called teleology, and it stands in opposition to the postmodern worldview because as Favali points out, that great line at the end of that section we just read, one's telos is to define one's telos. That's so postmodern. There is no givenness to what my telos is as a human being, or my telos as a sexual human being, or my telos as a human being when it comes to food. My goal or my existence is to define what my goal or existence is. Therefore, as she'll come to the second half of the book, even more so than this first half of the book, she talks about how our masculinity and femininity in this view do not have any ultimate telos. So why shouldn't my will be able to decide what my gender is, right? That's when we get into sort of gender reassignment surgery. What rests underneath the assumption that you can have a gender reassignment surgery is that the body is sort of a tabula rasa, as she says, a blank slate, a blank canvas, and I can do, my will can do what it wants to it. There's no given order to it. There's no given nature to it. There's no given telos for what my body should be. And so, if that's true, if there is no given telos, then if I choose through my will to change my gender through surgery, through hormones, then I should be allowed to do that. So keep this in mind, not only as you read this book, but as you, in our public discourse, engage with a lot of these, not just transgender topics or feminist topics, but just the postmodern mind in general. What's often unstated but sort of rests underneath any claims is that there is no telos to our lives in general, but to individual particular lives or to my body or to anything. That is their sort of fundamental assumption, or one of those assumptions. All right, last section I want to read and expand on. This comes from page 110. 110. This, I want to sort of connect here our previous discussion on original sin with this sort of postmodern worldview that we've been talking about today. Let's start at the bottom of page 110. The last paragraph. The ideal of autonomy has been central to modern feminism from its earliest days in the 19th century. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, foremother of the first wave of feminism, built her vision of women's liberation on a conception of the self as solitary, continually suspended in amber-like isolation. Woman lives alone, marooned like Robinson Crusoe on a solitary island where she alone is arbiter of her own destiny. This is Stanton's feminist anthropology. The human soul is in complete isolation, making the voyage of life alone. Despite our deep hunger of heart for love and recognition, nature takes the grueling lesson of self-dependence, self-protection, self-support. Stanton's picture of life and personhood is bleak. While she rightly points out the unrepeatability of each human soul, this is less a cause for awe than for desolation. There is no sense of community, reciprocal love, or interdependence. She takes what she calls the Protestant idea of individualism to a dismal extreme. We are more like projectiles spinning through space than interconnecting parts of a communal whole. So I think that's a really well-written paragraph, and I want to connect it back to what we talked about in our previous conversation about original sin, and that people often sort of dismiss the story of Adam and Eve as a stupid story about an apple, which, by the way, the text doesn't say it's an apple. So if you ever hear somebody use the word apple, that tells you that they haven't read the text closely. It just says a piece of fruit, right? In fact, there were no apples indigenous to the Near East. That's a sort of European fruit. So we talked about that the sin, as articulated by Augustine, the original sin, yes, of Adam and Eve, but the thing that's in all of us, the original sin that manifests itself in a variety of different specific individual personal sins, is the sin of pride, the turn inward towards the self. I want what I want, when I want it, and how I want it. again, people dismiss this story far too often as a stupid story, but I think what Favali is getting at here, especially at the end of that paragraph when she talks about this sort of, she calls it the Protestant idea of individualism, but it's even become a sort of secularized American understanding of radical individualism, right? Grab yourself by your bootstraps and pull yourself up. That what she's pointing to here is the sort of postmodern mindset is that fallen way of thinking, right? I don't want to be confined by my biology. I don't want to be confined by tradition. I don't want to be confined by cultural norms, by prescribed meaning, by anything, right? I just want my will to be uninhibited. I want to be like God. Remember, that's what the serpent sort of tempted Eve with, this idea of your by not being allowed to eat this fruit, that something is being withheld from you. And the postmodern mindset, especially here in this sort of feminist theory, but even next week more so in the gender ideology, this idea of I want no restrictions on me whatsoever. My will should be able to run rampant in any direction that it wants without restriction, even if that means, again, through hormones, through surgery, that I can radically change my body through modern medicine, through modern science. I should have no restrictions on that. I should be able to do what I want, when I want, where I want it, how I want it. So in many ways, I sort of look at this theologically, what's going on in this postmodern world that we live in, and in particular this manifestation of gender ideology, is to be just kind of the most recent, but sort of fairly radical articulation of that original sin, right? That pride, that turn inward towards the self. So I would argue to those who dismiss the story of Adam and Eve as a stupid, irrelevant story about fruit, that in fact it's the exact opposite, that in countless ways, the postmodern world that we live in is the story of Adam and Eve writ large. It is the story of, in all manifestations of life, that we should be able to do whatever we want, how we want it, without restriction.